Uh, Colleagues, maybe we can start. It's a short panel, so to make sure everybody can speak. Um, so first, welcome to the event. And I just introduce briefly myself. My name is Angelika Shamirina, and I work for UNDP, and I will be moderating this event. I'm the head of the Small Grants Program, Investing in the Communities. And this is a very interesting event, looking at private sector investments and how they can contribute to NDCs and acceleration of decarbonization. Without much ado, I would like to give floor to Dr. Vera Rodenhoff, Deputy Director General for International Climate Action and International Energy Transition from German Federal Ministry for the Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Please, Vera. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. So most of you have been around the COP for a while, and some of the phrases you've probably heard a lot is mobilizing private investments. And we all agree that we need to mobilize the finance, and finance must come from different sources. So some of it might be climate finance from developed countries such as mine. And that's one part of the equation, but we also all know that this can never cover all the expenses that climate change mitigation, adaptation needs to cover. So, and the problem then is most often the conversations stop there. So now let's talk about how can we mobilize that one part of the equation, which is the private finance. And so today, this mobilizing private finance is more the beginning of talking about it than the end. And so we're very glad that we could organize this event together with colleagues of UNDP and the We Mean Business Coalition to dive into this topic. And while it is true that, so let me just say in advance, while it is true that we, of course, need the private sector, apart from delivering on our climate finance commitments, we as states must also deliver on other things. And one is to send clear signals to the private sector, what's the direction, and also set clear regulatory frameworks. So clear signals, that means clear, ambitious targets to guide private actors, and also committed strategies for sectoral decarbonization and the right framework conditions. So that is one part of the equation. And when we look at the next round of NDCs to 2035, this will be our chance to deliver on it as countries. So, but this is also then where the private sector can come in once we've done our homework on setting the right signal and setting the right framework conditions. Because this is then where the private sector comes in to close the implementation gap with significant investments which are necessary. The emission gap report estimates that annual investments need to increase at least sixfold from current levels by 2035. And the private sector has to be the largest source of external finance coming in. And we know that today in emerging markets and developing markets, if you take China out of the equation, only 10% of climate finance goes there. So, and that's something that needs to change. But why is that so? One reason is that investors face clear challenges there. These are higher interest rates, currency risks, and just simply higher capital costs. And another are the framework conditions, which are not necessarily incentivizing private investment. And this is where the NDCs can come in. NDCs can work as these investment signals and create an investment-friendly environment, signaling that the direction is low carbon investments, signaling that we have ambitious targets, that they set out a little bit what the framework to tackle this issue looks like, and then the NDCs can act as investment plans if they are explicit enough and also concrete enough in what needs to be done. And then also this means that the private sector can be involved in how to set up the NDCs. So if we involve the private sector in our NDC development from the beginning, then they can tell us, do it more this way, do it more that way, so that the NDC development actually corresponds with the investment, with what the private sector needs to see to actually invest in these countries and to ensure feasibility of investment. So for that, we need to bring together stakeholders from the private sectors and from many other sectors, because often we don't necessarily understand each other because we have different mindsets, maybe sometimes in the private sector and the public sector. So with an intended additional support of 38 million euro from Germany for the UNDP Climate Promise, we actually want to do exactly that. We want to develop investable NDCs so they can guide policies and society as well as investors and private actors. And we further focus on the development of one part of it, the development of industry-specific NDC targets. Most NDCs up to now do not target the industry sector, but still this is sort of the next frontier, the decarbonization of industry. And it's highly relevant for private actors as well. So the industry sector is, but also other highly emitting sectors are critical to demonstrate that decarbonization is not only necessary, but it's also a business case. And it's an opportunity to gain high return and to stay the front runner in the game of this world decarbonizing, because this is where we're heading. And having that in mind, we in Germany, we've set up the Climate Club. I don't know if all of you know it. It was initiated in 2022. By now it has 43 members from all around the world. And one aspect we target there is to drive industrial decarbonization, especially in steel and cement, and also to help carbon leakage in that way, because if we're all in this together, we have similar or interoperable standards, we can create a level playing field and can all profit. And in that vein, just yesterday, my minister, together with the United Kingdom and the CIFs, the Clean Investment Funds, announced that we're pledging over 1.3 billion US dollars to support industry decarbonization. And for that, also we from Germany contributed significantly, and it was, I think, 220 US dollars that we contributed to that. So this is certainly a step that we want to take forward as we move to COP30 to further drive inclusive sustainable development all over the world and to mobilize significant private investments in EMDEs. And with that, I hand over to you for the panel. Thank you very much. Another speaker. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Andrew Prague, a Managing Director on Policy from Women Business Coalition, for a perspective from the business, from private sector, to see what are the challenges and barriers and what can be done.
Thank you very much for the invitation to share this event, in fact, from We Mean Business. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, Vera, for the excellent introduction. In fact, a lot of what you said is very similar to what I'm going to say from the private sector, so we're very aligned there, and for that, and that reason I will be as brief as I can, so we can get to the panel very quickly. But we all know, as you said, that the private sector are the engines of the transition. We really need that investment into the transition if we're going to make it happen. And while the challenge is getting ever more urgent in terms of climate change, we have the good news that the business case is really getting stronger all the time, and we see major businesses now who recognize that the climate risk is business risk. They see the impacts already in their value chains. It really makes them step up their case for action. And then we see, of course, the competitiveness business case of actually making this transition, improving all the time. But they do need the policy frameworks and the certainty to really deliver on that. And this NDCs update with the new NDCs this year is, of course, an excellent opportunity to do that. I just have a few slides which I'll go through quickly. Firstly, who is We Mean Business Coalition? So we are an NGO, but we work with some of the world's most influential businesses to drive action on climate change. We were founded 10 years ago now, before the Paris Agreement, by 7 organizations. You can see them there. Really to bring this ambitious voice of business into policymaking circles and really be the positive kind of advocacy voice that speaks louder than those who are trying to slow down the process. And we've now grown. We have a network of over 50 organizations and working with more than 17,000 businesses around the world. And as I said, always trying to drive this ambitious voice on the notion of an ambition loop, whereby if businesses really act and show they're acting and put that in front of governments, then it helps governments to be more courageous in terms of taking more policies, and then that drives more business action, and we have a positive cycle. We put out, in order to apply this kind of ambition loop in the NDCs, we put out this call to action for ambitious and investable NDCs, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. It sort of encapsulates some of what Vera was saying into a structure that we've been using to think about how the NDC itself relates through to the implementation and the policy frameworks that follow. In context, I mean, we all know that there's this big ambition gap in terms of where the current NDCs stand. This is from the ambition gap report last year, and we have to really make sure that this new round of NDCs does everything it can to close that gap. But what's, a little bit less talked about is the investment gap there is, and these are numbers from my former colleagues at the IEA just showing that while clean energy growth is growing very fast and is set to grow very fast under current policy settings, the gap to where it have to be at 2030 is still very significant, and you can see it there. And as Vera referred to in the global south, the gap is even bigger in that, as the IEA says, nearly 90% of clean energy investment is going to the OECD countries plus China, and that's something we really need to address through the climate finance process here in the UNFCCC. In this end, we put together this call to action from businesses, which is really trying to address this question of what it takes from a business perspective to make the NDC not only ambitious, but also investable, laying out therefore what we mean by that in terms of what businesses need to see from the whole NDC cycle to make it investable. This point that it's not just the NDC itself, it's how we see it translated into policy that really counts when you're a business looking at to see what are the regulations, what are the incentives, what are the tax credits, and so on. We used this process of developing this call to action to actually engage businesses, because what we found at the start of this year, talking to some of our major business partners, was that many of them weren't that interested in NDCs. It seemed very distant. So that's something at the UN. It's not a core business issue. So we engage them in this process to get them interested, see why it matters, why the NDC sets the direction of travel, provides the kind of certainty that they're looking for, and helps to really build that momentum. This is actually on the back of a campaign we launched and took to the COP last year, called Fossil to Clean, which really is bringing the business voice behind having strong language not only on clean energy transition, but also on fossil fuel phase out, and we've kind of framed this as part of that. Just to show very quickly what it is, this call to action, we framed it around 3 pillars to emphasize the fact that, well, the NDC itself is very important, and that's our first pillar. This translation into policy frameworks matters just as much in terms of getting the business investment really flowing. And thirdly, that the process, the transparency, the inclusion, the kind of co-creation with businesses and other stakeholders really matters for getting this right. Each of these 3 pillars has kind of 3 sub-pillars. So on the overall NDC, we see the importance of making sure the target is really clear, ambitious, and economy-wide, but it has to be also backed up by these sectoral targets, which may concern individual industrial sectors, or indeed the targets around renewable energy, around improving energy efficiency, and around phasing out fossil fuels, to reflect the language that was agreed in the stocktake. And then it needs to have a strong commitment that it will not just stay in the NDC, that it will end up in policy measures, which leads to the second pillar about the framework for policies for implementation. Now, this could be a whole presentation in its own right, but very quickly we just have 3 levels to say that we need the national strategy coming from the center of government at the highest level with a cross-ministry strategy to really make sure it's coherent. We need the sectoral level policies that actually drive the deployment and the innovation in the key sectors. And then we need the international element to really show there's the international collaboration needed to decarbonize some of the very difficult, heavily traded sectors, heavy industry, and so on. Then the third pillar is about this transparency, communication, making sure that the business sector is involved in the design of the NDC and also in the design of the policy framework, and that this is communicated positively around benefits to the wider society. Just to sum up, our point is that to be investable, the NDCs have to be ambitious, but they really have to follow through into this coherent policy framework. As always, businesses are crying out for stable, long-term signals, and the NDCs, if they follow through into policy, are an opportunity to do that. What are we doing next? So we see this as very much a road to COP30. We're working now, actually in partnership with the German government on the Foreign Office side, on developing a series of country-focused notes, making this more specific to each country, or not each country, a number of key countries, to then have policy messages that resonate with governments and which local businesses can speak up to. And we'll be taking that forward in the coming months as countries prepare their NDCs. So that was all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the panel here too. Thank you.
Andrew, you're in the panel actually.
I'm in the
also,
panel, okay.
Yes. So you're two things today, panel as well. So now, just because we don't have so much time and this discussion looks really interesting, I would like to invite very quickly our esteemed panel. So again, Andrew, you're one of the panelists. Also, I would like to invite Alex McNamara, head of the Environmental Unit and National Business Initiative in South Africa. So this is our business perspective, guys. I would like to invite Ariana Grifa, Senior Policy Manager in Institutional Investors Group on climate change, to look at the perspective of investors. Also, I'm sorry, I didn't meet the speaker, Lauren Mansi. Is she here? No, from Rwanda. Yes, sorry. I was looking for you, I didn't know. Okay, very nice to meet you. She's a climate finance manager in Rwanda Green Fund. And finally, Søren David, we're friends, so please, and the Director of Technical Support for NAMA facility. So we have a very diverse, okay, please reintroduce yourself. Okay, Mitigation Action Facility, I'm so sorry, but very diverse perspectives we have from the government, from the donors, from investors, from private sector. So I will start, and please feel free to quickly introduce your work before you answer the question, if you feel that. I'm just trying to save time. First question would be to our business association panelists, to Alex and Andrew. For business associations, how they can help align private sector investment strategies with national climate goals set out in the NDCs. First, it's kind of two-pronged, and also how these associations, business associations, can advocate for policy reforms that will help remove barriers to private investments in climate projects. Please, you have a few minutes. So try to be brief. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll be as brief as I can. So just to say, I will speak about a member-based organization in South Africa called the National Business Initiative. We're quite small but very influential. And so I think the answer to your question is that business associations can play a leading role. We know that from having led the climate agenda for business in our country for at least 10 years in what is one of the most carbon-intensive economies in the world. So if we can do it, I think many others can do that as well. I think we started by helping people understand the business case. I think Andrew mentioned that earlier. If companies see the business case, that already is going to spur investment. We help a lot with peer learning, just to understand what are the opportunities, what can I do. We can create a detailed evidence base. So we, as the NBI, ran research recently for 2 years where we unpacked every single major sector of the economy and said, could we achieve net zero by 2050 in each sector, from energy to transport to buildings, and basically created a business case and a platform of knowledge that has since been used by numerous actors, including our Presidential Climate Commission, and of course has been used by companies themselves. So boards read it, company decision makers read it, it gets internalized by companies, and they start to invest because it's good technical work, it's backed up by sound evidence, It shows commercial viability, and so it would make sense for the private sector to invest. So I mean, those are just some of the most basic areas that we've worked. The other area is collaborative action. So as a member-based organization, you're not just dealing with one company. You can work with multiple companies, so you can start to scale quite quickly. So if you have a business case, if you know where you need to invest, when you get to implementation and implementation support, an organization like NBI is a support in implementation, but also we can convene business and government, we can support business scaling together, and we've done that in many, many cases on energy efficiency and on renewable energy. I think my final point would be, specifically on policy, I would just say two things. One, our business view on what decarbonization could look like for our economy directly informed policy in our country. It was a very sound piece of work, a very strong stakeholder process. It therefore created a business ambition that was really, really credible. It directly informed our NDC, and the business statement on climate action basically resulted in a more ambitious NDC for our country. So it was exactly the ambition loop that Andrew was referring to. I think the other area I would see would be that there's great opportunity is the role that business associations can play in supporting an enabling environment for formal public-private partnerships, where essentially you can unlock private capital and expertise through formal contracts between the state and a private party, where those PPP regulations may exist in some countries, but the stronger and more effective they are, the more the private sector can be an investor and enabler of the transition.
Well, very, very interesting. Thank you very much, Andrew. Please, you can add in particular.
Well, I'll be very quick because that was excellent. And NBI is a terrific partner of ours in South Africa as part of our wider coalition. So absolutely subscribe to everything Alex was saying. Just two things I'll add is I think in general, business associations can kind of be the engine of this ambition loop that I was talking about, in that we really can provide the link, show companies, busy companies are not necessarily following all of the policy movements, the climate policy movements. We sort of point out where the opportunities are for reform, or where there could be an opportunity to move policy if the right voices speak up, and really sort of lay that out for them and provide the opportunity. And then, very importantly, provide what we call cover, right? Which is allowing businesses to see that they're not alone in this. And we find it sometimes it reminds me of kind of the school playground or something, that companies will just not go do something until they see someone else is doing it, and getting them both to go together, or several to go together, is really can unblock a lot. And the association can be that cover, and sort of allow individual businesses representatives to say to their board, we're not doing this alone, there are competitors going too, and that can really help. The other quick point I'd make is around what we call responsible policy engagement. And this is about making sure or associations can really encourage companies to be sure that all of their lobbying and advocacy activities are aligned with their climate goal. Often we find a company will have a strong climate target, science-based target or otherwise, but there'll be parts of the business in certain countries that are still lobbying against climate policy, and sometimes the central parent company might not even know, and sometimes they do know, and sometimes it's happening through a trade association. And really providing the framework for companies to be transparent about that and see and eliminate where there is negative advocacy on their own behalf is very helpful. So those are just 2 points I would add.
Thank you very much. So many opportunities outlined on how business associations can help. For another private sector investor perspective, I would like to address to Ariana Grifa and to ask what challenges, in fact, to see the other side a little bit, private investor face when aligning their portfolios with the goals set out in NDCs. And how can risk-sharing mechanisms such as private and public partnerships can reduce these challenges and these barriers and blended finance? How can they reduce these barriers? And a little bit of follow-up, how, on the other side, how NDCs investment plans should be shaped, need to be shaped to mobilize and guide private investments, particularly in industrial decarbonization. Thank you. It's a lot of questions, but Please reflect.
Thank you. I'll try to sort of combine an answer to that. And with thanks, obviously, to the organizer for inviting me to share some of the work that our IGCC has been doing and working with investors on investable NDCs. For those who are less familiar with the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, we're a membership organization. We count over 400 members across asset managers, asset owners, across 27 countries and representing over 65 trillion in US dollars in asset under management. We really bring together the investment community to accelerate capital towards net zero and a resilient world. In my role, I lead on sort of global policy engagement, really trying to help investors participate in and engage with the UNFCCC process, but other multilateral fora as well. And earlier this year, we worked with a group of our members to really understand how investors are using NDCs, if at all, and how these NDCs could be improved to send the right signals to investors and really communicate those investment opportunities to the private sector. The first thing that we found out is that a number of investors are looking at NDCs. Investors themselves are setting net zero commitment goals and aligning so that portfolio and investment strategies accordingly, and therefore are really looking at what countries' high-level commitments are, but most specifically also what their commitments at sectoral levels are. And so NDCs really do provide this really headline direction of travel to investors of where the country is headed, but doesn't necessarily provide the details on how the transition is going to look like across the economy in their specific countries and pinpoint where the investment opportunities are. So we developed some recommendations in a report earlier this year to really try to provide some feedback to the countries that at the moment are planning the new NDCs to really understand what are the right information that could provide that signal to investors. And some of the challenges, to go back to your question, with the current format of NDCs that we've been looking at, is that they are not granular enough, they're not credible enough, and they're not implementable. And just to expand a little bit on that, they're not granular enough. As I mentioned, a lot of NDCs do provide the economy-wide decarbonization targets, but do not provide enough details on the sectoral targets underpinning that. So providing that sort of sectoral pathways and the macroeconomic context in which the specific decarbonization targets are sort of created and developed is really, really important to really pinpoint how where the opportunities are going to be across the economy and in specific sectors. Second, they need to be credible. And to be credible, these sectoral targets need to be underpinned by solid policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks as well. Really understand which policies are going to get you to that target across the years. And last but not least, they need to be implementable. And to implement those targets, those actions, you need capital. So countries need to think about how you're going to finance those actions, how you're going to finance those policies, but most specifically, not just the cost, also the sources of finance, and particularly the instruments that you're looking to leverage to finance those actions. And that's where the sort of public-private partnerships and dialogue with investors and businesses is really key. We know that particularly in emerging markets and developing economies, the public finance will play a really strong role, including international climate finance, MDB finance. So how do you strategically use those funds to mobilize private capital through, for example, instruments such as guarantees, but also how you strategically use the public fund, for example, through sovereign bonds or sustainability-linked bonds, where investors can actually see how those instruments are aligned with their own climate strategies, and what they're going to invest in is going to be financing net zero target, implementable NDC targets as well. So just to sort of sum up, these are some of the recommendations in there, but really what we want to point out, and I think has been echoed by my colleagues on the business side of things, we really need to see a bit more dialogue on the implementation side of NDCs with investors, with businesses, to really trying to communicate when the investment opportunities are and where countries need to see the private sectors to come and deliver on some of the NDC targets. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So many interesting points here I would like to unpack, but we have more more panelists and more perspectives to provide. Lauren, would like to ask you some questions on the country perspective, right? As a finance manager in the Green Fund in the country, what are your experiences of cooperation with private sector actors to mobilize and catalyze investments for NDC implementation? That's one. And the other question is, how can governments and national funds create investment frameworks under NDCs and enabling environment that unlock greater private sector investment and climate action, perhaps on your country experiences? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Lorraine Manzi, Climate Finance Manager at the Rwanda Green Fund. And for those who are not familiar with what the institution does, the Rwanda Green Fund is the financing vehicle for green investments in Rwanda. And we're mandated to mobilize climate finance and reinvest it into transformational projects in both the public and private sector in Rwanda. So to answer your first question, I think some of the things that Rwanda has been able to do in terms of private sector engagement is to first, we had to go ahead and understand the needs of private sector to incentivize them in joining the space and be able to come into and collaborate with both the public sector and all the other stakeholders involved. That required a level of assessment and understanding their needs, and also moving forward and creating tailored financial instruments, but also de-risking some of the projects that they needed to come on board and using a blended finance approach and de-risking it, which is where we ended up creating ERMA Invest, which is a financing vehicle with the Development Bank of Rwanda. And we were able to then bring on board some private sector companies that were interested in some of the sectors, energy, climate smart agriculture, etc., to be able to implement some of the things. The second question was around, sorry.
That's okay. Creating enabling environments.
Yes.
To unlock the private sector investment.
Yes. So to be able to implement the NDC through enabling frameworks for private sector, the NDCs are already there. Some of these, there are strategies, there are guiding documents, but as she mentioned, to make them a bit more implementable, they have to be a bit more granular and a bit more detailed, so that everyone can come in and say, this is where I fit, this is what I can do. One approach we're piloting currently is what we call the programmatic approach, by creating investment plans for each sector, where the public and the private sector role is clarified, and it's basically disaggregated in a granular manner, and everyone knows where they can find themselves. Whether it's from a resource mobilization perspective, development partners can come in and say, this is where we think we're fitted. The public-private partnerships component is also clarified, and this allows for the de-risking part to happen, but also for the blended finance approach to be used to be able to implement projects at scale. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have the whole development from like private sector perspective to the investors to de-risking. So speaking of de-risking and public finance now, I would like to turn to Søren, who is head of technical support and mitigation action facility, and to see how can development finance institutions and multilateral organizations support governments in designing policy frameworks, investment plans, and risk-sharing mechanisms that can attract private sector investments to NDC implementation. So that's one. And again, related question, how can multilateral institutions foster cross-sector partnerships, for example, industry, energy, to scale up investments and align with NDCs and contribute to achieving global climate goals? First, support for governments, and then partnerships.
Thanks, Angelica, for these easy questions so late in the evening. Thanks to everybody for sticking around. From the Mitigation Action Facility, we are providing grant funding to actually bridge those funding gaps that exist in specific markets, in specific countries. And our belief really is that the NDCs, ultimately, they need to be broken down to very specific investments. Otherwise, it will not work. And what I've heard here is a bit of a complaint also to NDCs that they are not specific enough. I think they simply fulfill a certain function, and they will never be so specific so as to cover specific individual investments in countries. That is not their function. So that plea that I often hear that they must be even more granular, I'm not so sure if that is really justified. If they propose an ambitious framework as to what targets should be achieved by individual countries, I think that is already sufficient. But then, of course, in the next step, individual projects need to be developed and funded. And I think there is a public role, of course, in doing that. When you come from a business perspective, of course, we hear a lot about the carrot, so to say. I always hear private business talking about incentives, better framework conditions, less tax. I think that's the one side. But if you look from it from a public side, I think there's also a case to be made for the stick, actually. So I can only say that in our portfolio of more than 60 projects that we are supporting with funding up until now, I could think of a handful where substantial breakthrough has actually been achieved by introducing taxes and actually ensuring that private business fulfills function of public goods. There's one example we mentioned this morning that is on a regulation on packaging taxes in Mozambique. That was kind of the breakthrough to really make that project finally happening, and also ensure that private companies are actually investing because they are obliged to do so. So I think we have to see those both sides. And thus, it's always important that you have a public policy in there and public institutions setting the frameworks, defining what exactly an NDC might mean in a very specific sector. And once again, there can be incentives, but there can also, of course, be restrictions as to what private business can do. One other good example that comes to my mind is in the cement sector, in a country that I won't name, where the introduction of a carbon pricing scheme was actually ultimately the decisive point to move the private sector and to make them invest. So I believe there's those both sides. And of course, to close that funding gap and this financing gap that is there for private investment, there can and there should be public funding made available because ultimately the fulfillment of NDCs, of course, serves a public good. And that is something that we are doing with our projects that provide grant funding from 5 to 25 million euros per project to drive sectoral decarbonization in those three key sectors of energy, industry, and transport. So I think there is a lot of incentives out there, and we see a growing number of financial institutions. They might be bilateral, but more promising so even on the national level. And there's one example next to me where on the national level you have financial institutions that are created and built up just for the purpose to actually establish, mount these projects, fund them, ensure that the public side, the public interest is actually taken into account, and at the same time attract private funding. So we are very much looking forward to further collaborating in more detail with those national funding institutions that are created. Surely they need more concessional funding as well, and that we do provide. And there's, of course, other climate finance mechanisms out there who do that. In general, I believe the larger the ticket sizes for individual investment is, the more the need for funding of feasibility studies. So there's a lot of support already out there. I think it simply has to be tapped into better, and I think then we are really on a good way. And last remark, maybe the fact that the NDCs are getting more specific in terms of the sectors they're engaging with, and also they are getting more granular in terms of defining what exactly should happen will also make it easier for everybody involved, because then the funding that is provided also by donors can actually be better targeted than to simply say, yeah, we want to reach a certain climate goal. The more specific the NDCs define in which areas investment is supposed to be promoted, I think the better any funding support that is then provided can actually function and create those impacts that we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all panelists providing these very interesting perspectives. I'm very happy we actually finished a little earlier so we can leave time for some questions. I was worried that we won't have time for questions. But please, I would like to maybe hear some questions from the audience. Anyone, please? Questions? No? Yeah, you would? Yeah, please. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists. This was very interesting to listen to. I just want to say that in Kenya, and I hope many countries, that before we present our NDC target, we do a technical analysis that informs the mitigation sector. So as much as we give an economy-wide reduction target, there's a very clear contribution for each of the sectors that gets us there, then that is informed by the current policies and also the future policies. But the question that I had is what we're having a problem with, and maybe you have insights now that we have business on the panel, is how do we bring on board the private sector really? Because one thing, Kenya's NDC is majorly conditional. Conditional on international, so we have a very small percentage where we have our private or national support expected, and we expect that 87% of that comes from external support, including the private sector. But when it comes to investment planning, we have had a challenge of actually doing an NDC investment plan. We have not costed the costing of the projects themselves, and maybe there are countries that have done this or you have experience. How did you approach this? What criteria did you use to actually determine that this is the cost for investing in this NDC to create the business case for private sector to come on board?
Thank you very much. Any other question for now? Okay, another one.
Hello, I'm Colin McQuiston. I'm from Practical Action. I know the panel is on mitigation, but the idea of the NDCs is that they're whole of society climate action plans for that country. So it has to include adaptation. So I'd be really interested if any of the panelists have got any examples of where private sector and investment has actually been able to catalyze that change and actually deliver on the public goods that are needed for adaptation. Thank you.
So thank you. Two excellent questions. I would like to add, not personally from me, but also request, maybe if you have examples from countries, you don't have to name countries, but like what Søren gave example, very interested to hear specific examples, if you have any, while answering those questions. And any one last question, because then we'll have only answers. Yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. I have a question to ask with regards to the development of the NDCs, and here specifically the involvement of the private sector. I would like to know whether the private sector actually makes time to participate in the stakeholder engagement activities and make contributions towards the definition of the targets, as well as the possible measures that could be undertaken. And secondly, as a subset of my question, I would like to know from a social corporate responsibility perspective, how much is business actually ready to fund mitigation action related measures? Because a lot of what we hear about is how the government can incentivize businesses to participate, and I would just like to know what is it that business is bringing to the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Three questions. Who would like to take on Kenya's question? Volunteers? Yes, please. Thank you, Andrew.
Sure, have a go at a few in a way. I think for us, the way we're going to get business involvement in the NDC is probably a bottom-up sectoral conversation in a way. I think the NDC is, I think maybe to Soren's point, it's an enabling policy signal. It's very important, but we're looking, at least from our country perspective, at what are the sectoral opportunities that we can unlock right now. And that's a conversation you can have with business. It doesn't have to be a government only. It can be a co-developed sort of approach where you're looking at saying, in these sectors, what is achievable in the next 3 to 5 years? So you make it a much shorter time frame and you're having a commercial conversation. That's at least one way. So we think sectoral targets, sectoral plans, and sort of co-developing out where business and government sees ambition going in the next 3 to 5 years per sector is one way to really mobilize. Unfortunately, on the adaptation side, I mean, I think it is more difficult. We obviously strive in water and have some gains there, but water itself obviously is only one small piece of the adaptation piece or puzzle. On business consultation on the NDC, certainly in our country, they were very involved, both formal business and informal business, because it's an economic issue. I mean, climate change is now, we understand it's an economic issue. It's a financial issue. So that was our main driver. A key driver in terms of the business case was one, the low cost of renewable energy, two, growing trade-related risk in major markets. I don't know what in your country what it is, but a lot of our exports are directly trade exposed into European and American and other markets. So that trade-related driver is key. So it's a kind of a mixture of both. There's both opportunity and threat.
Yes, Andrew, please.
Just to compliment on the same kind of perspective in the private sector. Great questions. On this question of does the private sector make time, and how could you get the genuine engagement from the corporate social responsibility side of things? Well, firstly on the time thing, that's again the role of the sort of associations can really help to provide the opportunity, make it easy for them, and have the right people show up and make the liaison with the government and get the voices in there. So there's that kind of facilitation role. But more fundamentally, I think there's a distinction between those companies who are prepared to lead and can really be the vanguard in this, and then there's all the rest. And the leaders, the way we approach it, it's not about them engaging in corporate social responsibility. It's about them setting themselves targets for where they need to get to and transition plans to get there. And then that covers not only their operations, but also the so-called Scope 2 and Scope 3. So the energy that they purchase in, the emissions from that, and then, importantly, the whole value chain of their products downstream and then of their suppliers upstream. And that then, if you have a business that's actually set itself a binding target, the board is committed to it, and it covers the whole value chain, then it becomes a real kind of skin in the game business case thing, and the investment, the time commitment, the actual monetary investment follows. So that's the way we approach the leaders. But, and this gets to what I was going to respond to my co-panelists earlier, we're never going to solve the problem with just the leaders. So we have to be recognizing that there will always be laggards, and that the only way to really get them on board and to actually facilitate and allow the leaders to lead is to move towards more regulation, more kind of journey from voluntary to mandatory, where the laggards are no longer undercutting because they're being brought into line. That's where it gets harder, because then you meet real resistance, obviously, and that's where we need the leaders to be really courageous about pushing policymakers in the right direction. So that's what I would say to that one. On the adaptation side, it's totally right to raise it, and also don't have the good enough answers. I guess one thing I would say is that we're seeing that change pretty quickly now, because it's become so much of material business impact now in value chains. And wherever a business is based in the world, it has, if it's a big business, it's likely to have a kind of international, very complex value chain, and they're seeing the climate impacts time and again. So suddenly that's coming into the kind of bottom line calculation. So it's definitely jumping much more into the business sphere. But obviously in the past, it's been much harder to find the revenue. Some of these kind of mitigation, adaptation, joint projects rather, in the kind of nature-based solutions sphere. But yeah, you're right to raise it, because it is an absolutely critical question, which is we don't have enough of an answer to.
Yes, please, Ariana.
Perhaps jumping in on some of the questions that we received on the engagement side of things. So the work that we've done with investors really identified these gap in having consultations with investors, particularly on NDCs, but more broadly on climate strategies or national climate strategies as well. So one of the things that perhaps we identify and we sort of suggest as sort of course correct in the next NDC is around the understanding of the government's piece around NDCs. So a number of investors will like to engage with governments around their NDC targets, around their climate strategies, but don't know which ministry is responsible for what. So we're really trying to sort of push the message there that first of all, it needs to be a whole of society, but also a whole of government, and understanding is the finance ministry here in charge, is the climate ministries, environment ministries, etc. So that sort of clarifying that piece will also help investors reaching out and engage on the consultation. So we really hope to see a lot more sort of formal and informal dialogues happening, particularly on the opportunities of the NDC, but translated into more sort of regular dialogues on climate action in the later stage. And on the adaptation, again, really something that we have emphasized in our report as well. Obviously, the NDC has traditionally looked more at mitigation, but we really do emphasize any opportunities for adaptation, resilience, and just transition to be included in the analysis as well. And particularly to just pinpoint to some of our work that we are doing with our members. Traditionally, climate change has been a physical risk. That's how it started for private finance, but increasingly it's been moved to transition risk. And now we're sort of bringing it back to that with the development of the physical climate risk methodology. We recently published 10 case studies looking at how integrating these methodologies in asset valuation and looking at how returns are actually higher if you embed investment in adaptation and resilience from the start or in current assets. So adaptation will come as part of the overall investment in companies and assets rather than an additional sort of like thinking at a later stage.
Yes, thank you very much. More comments, perhaps Lauren, Søren, any? I'm just curious to hear like concrete examples. Yes, please, Lauren.
No, sure. I think maybe I'll touch a little bit on the consultation aspect. I think the way that our NDC were developed, private sector was definitely some of the most important stakeholders that we needed to bring on board. And I think he mentioned an actual example of what we actually used, where instead of trying to target everyone at mass, we actually used the approach of targeting some of the vanguard within the sectors that we do believe could set an example and also incentivize and remove that risk, fearing aspect that private sector usually have within this space and within climate-related projects or mitigation or adaptation projects. Most of the time, they don't actually understand it. So once you have that, once we use that approach, we've seen a lot more responses, and we've seen a lot more uptake of some of the initiatives and innovative financial instruments that we had on board that usually they would look at and say, no, we're not quite sure about this. We don't know the risks, etc. So that's one of the approach that we've used, and we also have some of the institutions that are in charge of making sure that engagement is actually upheld and strengthened. Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Finance, but also some of these umbrella organizations for private sector, and make sure that they're also on board during the consultations, and we make sure that the information trickles all the way down to the end beneficiary. And as well paired up with some capacity building aspect, which is a very important component of the NDC implementation as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Last comment, maybe.
Yeah, maybe
We're
to close with one example from our portfolio that is actually in Rwanda, where we are funding the transformation of the taxi sector in Kigali, in the capital, that is basically run on motorbikes. And they are transferred from combustion-driven to e-driven ones, and all that is required on the financial side is actually a guarantee portion to a loan facility provided by a national finance institution. There is equity there, so sometimes the funding gaps are actually not that big to have with a quite modest portion of the overall investment required, initiate the transformation that we all want to see, and actually leverage a lot of private funding.
Excellent. I'm afraid we have to leave the pavilion. Please close. Yes, we are exactly on time. I'm very impressed. Was very rich discussion of the panel. Many very, very interesting ideas. I hope everybody is coming with a new understanding, new ideas, and perhaps we continue this discussion on how to actually engage private sector. There are some good examples already, but we need, I think, what I still miss a little bit hearing, there's many ideas of how it can be done. Maybe next year we'll come to Brazil, right? With the examples how it was done already and how private sector capital was attracted to specific projects which were funded as part of NDCs, and how the NDCs were developed, refined with the private sector capital. Which is essential, right? This is the whole point, because NDC is just a framework. It cannot be only funded by public money. So with that, thank you very much, panelists. Very good discussion, and audience, thank you. Have a good night.